Hello Daily Drafters and welcome to the format follow-up video for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. It's been a fun few months here with the format, but every good thing must come to an end and it is now time to turn our attention to Streets of New Capenna, and in doing so we must bid farewell to Neon Dynasty in daily draft fashion. What that means exactly is that in this video I will provide you with color pair tier rankings followed by my top 10 takes on the format. If you have any desire to draft Neon Dynasty again in the future, such as a flashback draft on Arena or at home with your friends, this will be a great video to reference to give you a quick reminder on how the format shook out and what to be looking for in your revisits. With that out of the way, let's dive into my tier rankings for the two color decks in the format. Starting with the tier 4 decks, we have green-red, white-red, and blue-red. You'll notice right off the bat that each of these three decks has red in them, a point we'll expand on later. But these three decks were intended to represent the majority of the aggro decks in the format, and they really just didn't hit their mark. Attacking alone was a theme that actively worked against a typical aggro deck's game plan. There also just wasn't enough support for modified in the format, and blue-red's card quality just couldn't compete with the other decks in the format. In Tier 3, we have blue-green, blue-white, and red-black. I think these decks had a bit more potential than the Tier 4 decks, but they were still decks I was not happy to end up in. Blue-green didn't really have a great identity, but had some powerful cards at higher rarities. Unfortunately, you couldn't really support the deck at common, however. Blue-white ended up being much more of a good cards deck than vehicles, as the whole vehicles theme was pretty much just a flop. And red-black had some explosive games, but if you didn't have the support at uncommon with a few key cards, the deck was way too small. Tier 2 is the first tier of decks that I was happy to end up in the format, with white-black and white-green. White-black's theme of having an artifact and an enchantment on the battlefield at the same time was much easier to achieve than I originally anticipated, and the payoffs were really there at common and uncommon. And a great white-green deck could compete with just about any deck in the format. It was just hard to get all of the great cards all of the time, and it relied a little too much on uncommons and rares to really come together. And the Tier 1 decks of the format were blue-black and green-black. I actually drafted these decks a combined 12 times on the channel and ended up with a 68% win percentage with them. Now, what I loved about blue-black was that there were two ways to build the deck, and they were both totally viable. There was a control version with removal and sagas, and then there was a more streamlined ninja deck, which was much more focused on tempoing your opponent out. Green-black didn't really have much of a theme to lean back on, but the color combination had the absolute best commons and uncommons in the format, and it turns out that a deck of just those really could compete. Now we'll go ahead and dive into my top 10 takes on the format as a whole. Number 10. Aggro decks didn't get there. Now, don't take this to say that you couldn't put together a viable aggro deck if you were the only aggro drafter at the table, but in general, it was very difficult to take a good aggro card over slower but even better sagas. In fact, I ended up drafting red-white 0 times and red-green only once in the entire life of the format. Is that to say that I couldn't have won with them had I drafted them more? Not necessarily, but there were just much better cards in other colors that made it very difficult to end up aggro at the end of the draft. Number 9. You can main deck artifact and enchantment removal. Cards like Fade into Antiquity and Repel the Vile had plenty of great targets throughout all of the decks. It is important to note that I would only typically main deck removal that could hit both artifacts and enchantments, or in Repel the Vile's case, an enchantment or a large creature. The majority of the good artifacts in the format were very cheap and had enter the battlefield abilities, so using an entire removal spell on them was typically not where you wanted to be. Number 8. The cheap artifact decks didn't come together. These decks were heavily focused around red and usually paired with black or blue. There's a lot of cards that pay you off for casting other artifacts, but the problem is the other colors just went so much bigger than this. The one exception might be if you were able to pick up multiple Oni Cult Anvils and really grind that way, but a bunch of random 1/1 and 2/2 artifacts just didn't get the job done. Number 7. The official Daily Draft color rankings. Bringing up the rear in 5th place is red. After a large gap, we then have blue in 4th. In 3rd place, we have white. In 2nd sits green. And at the top, at number 1, we have black. And taking it one step further, if I had to group these into tiers, black and green would be tier 1, white and blue in tier 2, and red all alone at the bottom in tier 3. Number 6. Green is incredibly good at uncommon, but overdrafted. The power of green's uncommons almost hurts the color overall because of how coveted a lot of these cards were. Blossom Prancer, Boseiju Reaches Skyward, and Kapatek Wrecker were among the absolute best uncommons in the format, and if anyone took these cards early, it was very difficult to get into green behind them as a result. Number 5. Red is by far the worst color. I have seen other content creators have success with red in the format and claim that even though they also think red is the worst color, you can still have success with it. I never seem to be one of those people. In fact, I drafted 11 decks in the format in which red was one of the 2 base colors and ended up with a 35% win rate with them. I just could not figure out how to draft this color for the life of me, and if you're revisiting the format at a later date and only have a couple of drafts with it, I'd recommend steering clear of red unless you can be sure you're the only red drafter at the table. Number 4. Splashing is very easy and practically encouraged. There were 5 great ways at common to open up the ability to splash in the format, 2 of which were green and the other 3 of which were colorless. In addition, there was the complete cycle of gain lands running around as well, making getting the number of sources you needed to splash a card or 2 of another color pretty easy. Number 3. Removal is much worse than normal. I went on a bit of a journey with this in the format, but ultimately landed on the fact that the removal spells like the ones you see on your screen just weren't great in the format. Now, would I ever cut the first copy of any of these cards? Probably not, but in a format where seemingly every creature had an enter the battlefield ability or drew a card already or had already gotten 2 chapters of a saga to resolve and was now a creature, 1-for-1 removal was just a little underpowered. Number 2. Sagas are king. There was a question early on in the format as to whether or not these sagas that flipped into creatures would be too slow. The answer is no. Let's take Life of Toshiro for example. Multiple times in the format, this card killed 2 of my opponent's creatures and became a 2/3 body, all for just 2 mana. If you told me I could have a 2 mana 2/3 that kills 2 creatures, I'd say you're insane. And there were plenty of sagas in the format that did at least this or even more. Now, that's not to say that you should just load your deck up with 23 sagas and call it a day, but 5 to 8 or so ended up being very powerful. Number 1. This is a format that revolves around 2-for-1s. I've thrown up all the commons in the format that I could find that were straight up 2-for-1s, not even counting others that you could argue gave you the value of a 2-for-1, like all of the sagas, among others. There was more value to be had in Neon Dynasty than just about any format in recent memory, and if you didn't board that value train, you were left in the dust. Thanks so much for tuning into the channel for the life of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and if you didn't get to see many drafts or you just happen to discover this format follow-up video, go ahead and subscribe to the channel to get in nice and early on the new format. Your Streets of New Capenna set review content will be hitting the channel in the next couple of days, and you will absolutely want to be tuned in to stay up to date and ahead of the game. Thanks again for being here, and I will see you later this week for more daily draft content.